Welcome to the Gentleman's Night Show. Welcome to Ignorantia Legis. Ignorantia Legis, mga kaigsunan, October 22, 2020. This is our episode number 23. So, wala ibaw, 23 episodes na ta. And this is JD Benz, ang inyong law professor online. Law professor. Giga paminaw eh. Ilas kayo paminaw, no? Law professor online. Anyway, salamat sa pag-uban ka na kong kaigsunan, and I hope you are available there. Naminaw mo na to. And natong kinsa tong nasa tong chat room nato sa atong chat naba mo diha Legis chat. Okay. Ba na to si Rodolfo Almodil. Grabe ang Almodil. Almodil! Musta ng battery na to eh? O si Abo, namina po na to. Loud and clear ko no. Matod pa ni Nida Remedios o nga naa sa Norway. Okay. Ako no mandawin ako no si Juan Rodolfo nagtanaw karon. Na-greet imong asawag anak niya. Okay, mong mga special friends. Okay. Na mga text nga nahibilin gikan sa CBIT kanina, the teachers will have no more jobs. Nagyapon jobs ng teachers. They will just be doing the checking and coordinating. Alex Villarmino ang mayang hapon. Kasi GT mayang hapon. Kasi gikan ni Philippine Menyosa, si Mike Spector, matod pa niya. How about the lectures of Hilarion Lim? Pwede na sa YouTube. Makuha na si Hilarion Lim. Ma-outdated na siya. Kaya na may dagang mo sa YouTube. Calculus was one of the subjects I dislike in high school. Gikan ni ABO. Pero Sir Alex, ang sabot na ko na nagamit ito sa YouTube ato para more or less ma-familiarize mo ba? Matod pa na iti alisaka, beware of the various vids that are not correct. Part na sa atong kuan. Part na sa atong awareness. I had my elementary and high school at Cebu Eastern. Doon may calculus sa second year high, sa senior high. Palpak akong agi. Kaya hinay kaya ko sa math. Nagamit pa kag YouTube ato, makasabot ka. Naglibog akong kutaw nga naminaw ni Atty. GT. Maybe gradually I'll be able to observe it as you recommended. Magsergi yung tanaw sa YouTube yun. Lo sa Sagritalo, naminaw po na to. O si Yannick Cindy, o si Joshua Bindia, watching from Caloocan, Metro Manila. Kaya na kung nakas Hilpuyat ang video. Kaya Bindia po. Okay. Alright. Okay, so naka round 1 na ta sa atong introductory courses. So we're following the bar the bar syllabus for the topics. So balik ta sa political law karon. Okay, so that's political law. Tanawan na itong headlines. Right. So, itong headlines, magkaigsunan na ito ng tanawon karon. Hindi na tanawan din sa itong headlines. At sa itong crawler, by the way, sa manira na, ang kuha na ito, itong topic karon. Balik ta sa political law. Introduction, marmar ka ito ni siyang kuhan ba? Ato na siyang atong gi-round. Ito siyang gi-round. Narita sa political law. Sometimes mag-overlap atong discussion magkaigsunan kaanam sa nang logo, mag-overlap kung sana siya. Mga topics sana. So, mga basic kuan ba tong idea sa tong kuan na sa una. Okay, sa the Philippine Constitution na to makaigsunan is the effectivity date, again, De Leon versus Isguera in 1987. The date of the plebiscite is the effectivity date and not the date it was proclaimed. The ratification. It's not the date of the proclamation of the ratification but the actual date of the plebiscite. Lahi ni siya sa katong, di ba? Kanang inig proclamation na nimo sa kadaog ka sa pagka-mayor, mo tayo mo effectivity date pagka-mayor, pero pag proclaim ka niya ni take oath ka, kini ang day of election, day of the plebiscite, ang effectivity sa 1987 Constitution. Basic principles niya. And the Philippine Constitution is a written, enacted, and rigid. Basic principles, verba legis or verba legis. Ang pronounce ng V. Wayman. Verba legis. Whenever possible, the words used in the Constitution must be given their ordinary meaning except when technical terms are employed. Ratio legis est anima. The words of the Constitution should be interpreted in accordance with the intent of the framers of the Constitution. And ut magis valeat quam periat. Ut magis valeat quam periat. The Constitution should be interpreted as a whole. Francisco versus House of Representatives in the year 2003. Now, types of judicial review. The European Judicial Review versus the US Judicial Review, which is followed by the Philippines. Under the European Judicial Review, constitutional courts, centralized, only one can exercise. In the US Supreme Court, which is adopted by the Philippines, decentralized, all courts can exercise judicial review. Principal letter. So, in the European judicial concept of judicial review, they follow the principle of principal letter. Questions are independent of the disputes. Principal letter. Under the US Judicial Review, ang iyang ngana is the principle adopted is the incidenter. Question that is recognized by the court must be part of the controversy. So, incidenter, there must be an incident, there must be a controversy. Principal letter sa European is questions are independent of the dispute. So, they can answer questions even without being related to a particular dispute. And incidenter concept in the US Judicial Review followed by the Philippines is the question that is recognized by the court must be part of the controversy. Dili pwede part sa controversy. . Now, parts of a constitution. Kung ano yung na-mention before. One is the constitution of government. So, parts is the constitution. The constitution of government establishes the structure of government, its branches, and its operations. The second part is the constitution of sovereignty. Provides how the constitution may be changed. Next is the constitution of liberty. So it states the fundamental rights of the people. For example, Article 3. So there are three parts of the constitution. Constitution of government, constitution of sovereignty, constitution of liberty. So GSL. 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 Amendments and revisions. So, basic na siya, how do you make the constitution, how to amend, and how to revise. O kung sa'yo, diferensya ng diba? Amendments and revisions. Concepts. Amendments. An addition or change within the lines of the original constitution, as well affect an improvement or better carry out the purpose for which it was framed. A change that adds, reduces, or deletes without altering the basic principles involved, affects only the specific provision being amended. That's as explained in Lambino versus Comelec. Revisions. A change that alters a basic principle in the Constitution, like altering the principle of the separation of powers or the system of checks and balances. Alters the substantial entirety of the Constitution, as when the change affects substantial provisions of the Constitution. Change. Okay. So what's the difference between an amendment and a revision? Okay. Revision generally affects several provisions of the Constitution, while amendment generally affects only the specific provision being amended. This distinction is significant because the 1987 Constitution allows people's initiative only for the purpose of amending, not revising the Constitution, as discussed in Lambino versus Comelec. By the way, ang people's initiative is not for the purpose of revising, but only for the purpose of amending the Constitution. Now, in the Lambino case, Lambino versus Comelec, the Lambino case discussed the two-part test, legal tests siya, whether it's amendment or whether it's a revision. The quantitative tests and the qualitative tests. Okay. So, kumusta na mo di ang kaigsunan? Mina ba mo? Diba? Which is okay. So, what is the quantitative test? The quantitative test, in the quantitative test, the court examines only the number of provisions affected and does not consider the degree of change. One a quantitative test. Okay. Now, what is the qualitative test? Oops. Bali. Sorry na, i-adjust din magkaisura na. Nabali. Where's the... Where are you, Jara? Now, in the quantitative test, the court examines only the number of provisions. Quantitative test na. But for the qualitative test, the court inquires into the qualitative effects of the proposed change in the Constitution. The main inquiry is whether the change will accomplish such far-reaching changes in the nature of our basic governmental plan as to amount to a revision. The changes include those to the fundamental framework or the fundamental powers of each branches, and those that jeopardize the traditional form of government and of the system of check and balances. Whether there is an alteration to the structure of government is a proper subject of inquiry. A qualitative test. Quality, no? Quantitative test, how many provisions? So these are the tests considered. It's called the two-part test, considered in and discussed in Lambino versus Comelec. Now, the procedure of the amendatory process. The procedure. There are two steps in the amendatory process. A. Proposal. This refers to adoption of the suggested change in the Constitution. The proposal. Congress, acting as a constituent assembly, not as a Congress, but as a constituent assembly. Adoption of the legislative change in the Constitution. 2 steps. A is the proposal. Congress, as a constituent assembly, the vote by a vote of 3/4 of all its members. Of course, when you say Congress, that includes the senators. Okay, Congress is actually the entire body, the entire legislative body, Congress. Now, Congress is divided into 2 parts. The first part is what's the first part? The Senate. And the second part is the HOR, H-O-R, House of Representatives. So when we say Congress is the entire legislative body. So the Constituent Assembly by a vote of 3/4 of all its members. So ang senador o ang congressman pareha sila gibukaton sa vote. All its members. That's one. The adoption, the proposal for the adoption of the change. Di pa na ang approval because the approval has to be by a plebiscite. Proposal pa siya. So A, Congress itself can make a proposal. Number 2, there could be a proposal to amend or to revise using a constitutional revision, a constitutional convention. And number 3, the people themselves directly through the People's Initiative. Okay, that's the proposal part. And then there's the ratification part. So again, in the proposal for the amendatory process with the revision or amendment, there are 3 ways to start with a proposal. Through Congress, through a constitutional convention, or through the people using the People's Initiative. Now, nga sa Congress. Congress as a constituent assembly by a vote of 3/4 of all its members. All. So, both the Senate and the House of Representatives, i-add na sila. It's not like 3/4 of the 3/4 of the Senate and then 3/4 of the House. No. The House and the Senate, i-add na silang tanan 3/4 of all the members. Number 2, Constitutional Convention as a mode of the proposal called into existence. So there are 2 ways to call for a Constitutional Convention. Number 1, by 2/3 of all members of Congress. Again, Congress, not House of Representatives, all members of Congress. Do not be confused between the term Congress and the term House of Representatives. Kaya gitawag nito Kongreso, mga congressman, House of Representatives na sila. So, by a vote of 2/3 of all its members of Congress, to call for a constitutional convention, para itang balibog atong sumaray sa usab, ha? Proposals could be by Congress, by constitutional convention, or by the people. 3. Now, Congress, as a constituent assembly, 3/4 of all its members. All its members. That means, lump sum ni sa Senate o sa House of Representatives. Number 2, the proposal could also be made by a constitutional convention, but the constitutional convention in itself can be called into existence by 2 different processes. First, to call for a constitutional convention, 2/3 of all its members of Congress, or 2, the electorate in a referendum called for by a majority of all members of Congress. Majority of all members of Congress. Ano siya? Majority of all members of Congress. So, duha, to call for a constitutional convention. Number 1, by 2/3 members of all Congress. Or number 2, by the electorate through a referendum. And that referendum must be called for by a majority of all members of Congress. So, libog na. I-repeat lang niya akong video para di mo ka. Number 3, para di mo malibog. Number 3, these are the 3 ways of proposing. Proposal pa niya. Proposal. Again, by Congress, by Constitutional Convention, and by the people through the initiative. Now, this people's initiative for amending the Constitution it is a petition of at least 12% of the total number of registered voters nationwide, where every legislative district must be represented by at least 3% of the voters therein. May problema na kay every legislative district. May pang-referendum na lang ka. So, 12% of the total number of registered voters nationwide, but at the same time, there's a sub-condition which requires for a 3% representation in every legislative district. So, the people who will vote that petition must also have, the petition requires that every legislative district mabot of 3% of the registered voters ani pirma. Now, limitation on people's initiative. No amendment in this manner shall be authorized in these 2 conditions. Number 1, within 5 years following the ratification of the 1987 Constitution, useless na siya. Number 2, more than once every 5 years thereafter. So, once every 5 years. Limitation siya initiative. Pero pag inimitabo mag-exam, siya na 12%. And there must be an enabling law. Constitutional provision on amendments. We're talking about Constitution. Dili ni siya wato'y labot ang magbuhat o balaod, ha? Like sa ABS-CBN franchise. Enabling law. Constitutional provision on amendments via people's initiative are not self-executory. There must be an enabling law how to do that. Na naman. Santiago versus Comelec. Senator Santiago versus Comelec in 1997. So they required an enabling law, enabling the people's initiative. Ratification. So, first, proposal man to for the amendments to the Constitution or amendments or revisions sa Constitution. And we call it amendatory process just to be generic more. That was the proposal. So, the proposal can be done by Congress, by Constitutional Convention, by the people, and ratification of the proposal. The proposed amendment shall be submitted to the people and shall be deemed ratified by the majority of the votes cast in a plebiscite held not earlier than 60 days nor later than 90 days after the proposal. So, sabutan ng dili earlier than 60 days para natay time magdebate sa mga proposals for 60 days. After the approval of the proposal by the Congress or the Constitutional Convention, and after certification by the Comelec of the sufficiency of the petition of the people. So, the doctrine of proper submission, libog man sila. A plebiscite may be held on the same day as a regular election. Gonzales versus Comelec, 1967. The entire Constitution must be submitted for ratification at one plebiscite only. So, di ingon nga part 1 sa Constitution, lain nga plebiscite, part 2, dili pwede. The entire Constitution. And the people must have a proper frame of reference. No piecemeal submission is allowed for ratification of the Constitution, the internal Constitution, e.g. submission of an amendment, age amendment ahead of the other proposed amendments. Di pwede nga sunod-sunod ang amendments. Note, the process of revision is the same in all respects except that it cannot be proposed via a people's initiative. Lambino versus Comelec. So, revision, the process for revision amendment, they're the same in all respects except that it cannot be proposed via a people's initiative. Ang revision of the Constitution. Amendment pwede, revision di pwede. People's initiative, I mean. Judicial review of amendments. The validity of the process of amendment is not a political question because the court must review if the constitutional processes were followed. Again, Lambino versus Comelec. So, ato ning isummarize the two stages of the amendatory or the revision process. Now, for amendments, the party or the person doing it or the group doing it is Congress as a constituent assembly or via constitutional convention or via the People's Initiative. That's for amendments. For revisions, it can only be done by Congress as a constituent assembly or constitutional convention. Again, People's Initiative is not a mode of introducing a revision, only an amendment. Right. Now, table of cases concerning constitutional amendments and changes in government. In Mabanag versus Lopez, a case in 1947, congressional resolution proposing the parity amendments. Kaya naman to yung parity sa una, di ba? After 1946, July 4, 1946. And parity, I mean, the US citizens are given parity as Filipinos. Kaya, mara pag nangwatsad sila ba? Naniguro sa sila, samtang ilatang ko anong. Litang buhian. The resolution of Congress proposing the party amendment was assailed on the ground that it did not comply with the 3/4 rule prescribed by the 1935 Constitution. Facts held and the reasoning. Petition dismissed. The proposal of amendments to the Constitution is a political question. The enrolled copy of the resolution in which it was certified that the proposal had been approved by the required vote was conclusive upon the courts. But this is no longer the controlling view. So before, the courts cannot inquire into the validity of the votes approving the proposal. Dili pa ni approving the amendment, simply merely approving the proposal of the amendment, because the amendment themselves will only be adopted after a plebiscite. Kini ang proposal pa ni siya. This has been modified by the Gonzales case and Tolentino. So, Gonzales versus Comelec. Resolutions of the both houses calling for the 1971 Constitutional Convention and amendments to the 1935 Constitution. Panahon ni Marcos. Ha? Okay. RBH resolution of the both houses, number 1, called for an increase in the membership of the HOR. RBH number 2 called for a constitutional convention, and RBH number 3 called for the amendment of Section 16, Article 6 of the 1935 Constitution to allow members of Congress to become delegates to the Constitutional Convention without losing their existing seats in the House of Representatives or in Congress themselves, including the senators. Petitioners seek to restrain the respondents from enforcing the law passed by Congress, submitting RBH 1 and 2 for ratification during the general elections on November 1967. So what happened in Gonzales versus Comelec? Petition denied. The petition of those who wanted to go against, to prevent the Comelec from doing it. The proposal of amendments is not a political question, but a justiciable question subject to judicial review. So, manin siya ron, ang Mabanag versus Lopez nga case in 1947, ning-ingon na the proposal of amendments is a political question. But this has now been modified. Ang Supreme Court has said, reverse itself, has been modified by the Gonzales case in 1967. Okay, so the petition is denied, but here are the conclusions of the Supreme Court. The proposal of amendments is not a political question, but a justiciable question subject to judicial review. So now, it is subject to judicial review. Number 2, Congress may propose amendments and at the same time call for a constituent assembly. So, manay gihold. Yes, ang Kongreso, again, when we say Congress, it's both a combination of the House and the Senate. Congress may propose amendments and at the same time call for a constituent assembly. Uy, maingon ang kuhan nga, pwede nila. Pwede. Matod pa sa Supreme Court. And ratification may be done simultaneously with a general election or in a special election called specifically for that purpose. And it was said that it was a proper submission of the proposal. Submitted it to sa Comelec for plebiscite. Now, Tolentino versus Comelec in 1971. The question here is the validity of a Constitutional Convention resolution submitting for ratification the proposal to lower the voting age to 18 years old was assailed by Tolentino. The question here is whether piecemeal amendments to the Constitution could be submitted to the people for ratification or of rejection. That means lowering of the voting age. Now, the Supreme Court said, petition granted. Tolentino is correct. All amendments proposed by the same Constitutional Convention shall be submitted to the people in a single election. dili piecemeal. Now, daghan patag mga cases regarding amendation cases magkataron discuss next time, alanganin na magsugod taron. So man mga interesting tayo, no? Political law, constitutional law. Anyway, salamat sa iyong pakiguban ka na ko makaigsunan. It is now the 22nd of October 2020. This is episode 23 of Ignorantia Legis. If you want to follow the series, go to YouTube. Unya sa YouTube, sa YouTube, you can make a playlist of all the Ignorantia Legis titles. Murag murag na siya nato o kanang it's like our law school online. Di sa on air na online na lang. Law school online. Salamat sa nakiguban ka nato makaigsunan. Sila si Joshua Bindia, Abeth Ejercito, Wilson Herrera, Jennifer Ricarty, Esther Candia. Alright. So thank you and good afternoon. Salamat sa pag-uban ka na po. Bye.